Breaking news tonight on Canada Today, and we are witnessing what may be the most significant diplomatic rupture between Ottawa and Washington in a generation, as Donald Trump has once again targeted the Canadian economy with a barrage of misinformation threats and ultimatums that have left trade experts and political leaders on both sides of the border scrambling to respond. The former and now current political force, Donald Trump, is doing exactly what he has done throughout his entire turbulent career, which is making sweeping accusations completely devoid of evidence and threatening international partners without any legal or economic justification, while using weaponized misinformation as a blunt political instrument. This time, his target is not a distant adversary, but America's closest ally and largest trading partner, Canada. Once again, he is claiming that Canada has somehow taken advantage of the United States in a narrative that is as tired as it is factually incorrect. Once again, he is demanding compensation for something that the American taxpayer did not pay for, and once again, he is threatening massive economic disruption based on claims that are demonstrably false. This morning, we are breaking down the anatomy of this crisis, which centers on the Gordie Howe International Bridge connecting Windsor, Ontario, and Detroit, Michigan. In a rambling social media post that went live late last night, Trump threatened to actually block the physical opening of this critical infrastructure project. In a post exceeding 400 words, Trump listed several grievances ranging from the bizarre to the economically illiterate, including complaints about U.S. alcohol being pulled from Canadian shelves to wild conspiracy theories that Canada is plotting a secret trade deal with China, which he claims would somehow spell the end of ice hockey and the Stanley Cup as we know it. But the core of the threat was his declaration that he will not allow this newly built bridge to open until the United States is, quote, fully compensated for everything we have given them. To understand why this is happening, we have to look at the facts, because the facts tell a story that is diametrically opposed to the narrative coming out of Trump's camp. The Gordie Howe International Bridge is not a project that America paid for and was cheated out of owning. The reality is that Canada paid the full construction cost, which exceeds $6 billion. The bridge will be jointly owned by Canada and the state of Michigan in a partnership that was agreed upon years ago. American workers and American steel were heavily involved in the construction process, and perhaps most ironically, Trump himself previously called this very project vital and fast-tracked it during his previous time in the spotlight back in 2017. This is not a misunderstanding, and it is not a difference of opinion. This is a public narrative built on incorrect information designed to inflame tensions for domestic political gain. This controversy was not an isolated incident, but rather the latest escalation in a pattern of behavior that seeks to destabilize the North American trading relationship. Trump's post also accused Canada of undermining American alcohol sales and threatening the cultural institution of hockey, none of which is grounded in policy reality. Even journalists who have spent years covering Trump describe this specific post as meandering, unfocused, and filled with false assertions that would be laughable if the economic stakes were not so incredibly high. Observers have noted that Trump is now surrounded by a cadre of advisors who reinforce misinformation rather than challenge it, creating a dangerous feedback loop where false claims become political talking points, and those talking points become threats, and those threats eventually mutate into a full-blown diplomatic crisis. However, unlike in previous years, the Canadian response has shifted dramatically. Rather than scrambling to appease Washington or escalating the rhetoric with angry tweets of his own, Prime Minister Mark Carney responded with a cool, detached recitation of the facts. He explained clearly that Canada paid for the bridge, that ownership is shared, that both Canadian and American workers participated, that both economies benefit, and that cross-border commerce depends on it. Carney framed the project not as a point of conflict, but as a symbol of cooperation, and his response demonstrated a level of institutional maturity that highlighted the stark contrast between the leadership styles in Ottawa and Mar-a-Lago. He corrected misinformation without inflaming tensions. He defended Canadian interests without resorting to theatrics, and he reaffirmed the value of partnership while firmly rejecting the premise of Trump's grievances. The U.S. president insists Canada must fully compensate the U.S. despite the fact that more than $6 billion in cost was entirely funded by Canada. Prime Minister Carney was asked about this ultimatum as he headed into a cabinet meeting earlier today, and his words were carefully chosen to dismantle the argument without provoking a trade war. He stated that he discussed the bridge with the U.S. president and explained that Canada, of course, paid for the construction, over $4 billion of it directly, and that the ownership is shared between the state of Michigan and the government of Canada. He highlighted that in the construction of the bridge, there is obviously Canadian steel and Canadian workers, but also U.S. steel and U.S. workers involved, making it a great example of cooperation between our countries. But beyond the calm demeanor of the Prime Minister lies a harsh economic reality, which is that Trump's threat to block the bridge is not only unjustified, it is economically irrational and potentially suicidal for the industrial Midwest. The Windsor-Detroit corridor is one of the busiest trade routes in North America, with billions of dollars in goods crossing it annually. Thousands of American jobs depend on the seamless flow of parts and finished goods across that border, particularly in the automotive sector, where a single vehicle part might cross the border 6 or 7 times before the car is finished. Any attempt to disrupt this flow would hurt Michigan, Ohio, and the Midwest first and hardest. Even Democratic leaders in Michigan, who often find themselves at odds with Trump on every other issue, publicly rejected his claims and confirmed that the bridge will open because they know that their state's economy depends on it. This reveals the underlying reality that Trump's rhetoric is completely disconnected from economic consequences. Ontario Premier Doug Ford went even further in his response and openly questioned whether Trump would follow through, not because of goodwill, but because of political self-interest. Ford pointed out that harming cross-border trade would damage the American economy and hurt Republicans in upcoming elections, framing Trump's threat as political theater rather than serious policy. Ford also dismantled Trump's specific claims with a bluntness that Carney avoided. When Trump said that America had no ownership stake, Ford responded that ownership is shared. When Trump said no U.S. workers were involved, Ford responded that American workers participated. When Trump said no U.S. materials were used, Ford responded that American materials were absolutely used. This was not political spin, it was verification, and it showed that Trump's narrative collapses under even minimal scrutiny. Perhaps the most important moment came when Ford addressed Canada's broader strategic response, warning against appeasement and urging the federal government not to roll over. He rejected the idea that Canada has taken advantage of the United States and emphasized that Canada deserves respect. This was not about confrontation for the sake of confrontation. It was about self respect and setting boundaries. It was about refusing to accept false accusations as the basis for negotiations. The Premier stated clearly that his message to the Prime Minister and the people of Canada is that this is not the time to roll over and let President Trump take advantage of us. He rejected the narrative that we have taken advantage of the Americans, stating effectively that it is the other way around. So, what is really driving this latest outburst if the facts are so clearly against it? It is not the bridge, and it is not compensation. The driving force is a loss of control. For decades, the United States held massive economic leverage over Canada because it was Canada's dominant and almost exclusive trading partner. That dependence shaped negotiations and limited Canada's options for generations. But under Prime Minister Mark Carney, that dynamic has fundamentally changed. Canada has aggressively expanded trade with Europe and Asia, strengthened ties beyond North America, and reduced its exposure to political instability in Washington. As a result, American leverage has declined, and Trump knows it. This loss of influence is largely the result of his own confrontational policies from his previous term. By weaponizing trade and undermining trust, he pushed partners like Canada to diversify. Canada responded strategically while Trump is responding emotionally. These exaggerated threats and false accusations are not signs of strength, they are signs of frustration, reflecting an attempt to reassert a level of control that is simply no longer there. Trump is reacting to a reality he helped create, and these attacks are increasingly desperate efforts to regain leverage he has already lost. Donald Trump's latest attack on Canada is built on false premises, but it reveals a true shift in the geopolitical landscape. Canada paid for the bridge, Canada shared the benefits, and Canada cooperated in good faith. The accusations are wrong, the threats are reckless, and the rhetoric is irresponsible. Mark Carney responded with facts. Doug Ford responded with resolve, and both demonstrated that Canada will not accept misinformation as diplomacy. They showed that leadership in this new era means correcting lies, defending national interests, and refusing to be intimidated. This is how serious countries respond to unserious threats. Let's dig deeper into the specifics of the bridge itself, because the sheer scale of the misinformation regarding the Gordie Howe International Bridge is staggering when you look at the public record. This project has been in the works for decades, and the financing model was developed precisely because the United States federal government and the state of Michigan were unable or unwilling to fund their share of the project at the time it was greenlit. Canada stepped up to finance the entire project, including the U.S. port of entry, to ensure that trade would continue to flow. The arrangement was that Canada would recoup its investment through toll revenues over several decades. This was a strategic investment by Canada to protect its economic lifeline, not a scheme to rip off the United States. To now claim that the U.S. is being cheated when they effectively got a free bridge built by their neighbor, which they will jointly own and which employed their workers, is a level of gaslighting that is rare even in modern politics. The mention of the Stanley Cup and ice hockey in Trump's post adds a layer of surrealism to the crisis that cannot be ignored. By tying a critical infrastructure project to a conspiracy theory about hockey in China, Trump is attempting to weaponize cultural insecurities alongside economic ones. It suggests a chaotic approach to governance, where policy is driven by stream of consciousness grievances rather than strategic calculation. However, the danger is that even absurd threats can have real-world consequences if they spook investors or cause delays at the border. Logistics companies and manufacturers operate on certainty, and when the leader of the world's largest economy threatens to blockade a major trade artery, it introduces a risk premium that costs everyone money. We also need to look at the domestic Canadian political alignment here. It is rare to see a Liberal Prime Minister like Mark Carney and a Conservative Premier like Doug Ford so perfectly aligned in their messaging. Usually there is daylight between the federal and provincial governments that can be exploited by foreign leaders. But in this case, the absurdity of Trump's demands has created a unified Canadian front. Ford's support for Carney's position strengthens the Prime Minister's hand, significantly allowing him to speak for the entire country without worrying about domestic sniping from his right flank. This unity is a critical asset in dealing with a chaotic partner like Trump. The economic implications for the auto industry are particularly acute. The just-in-time manufacturing model relies on parts crossing the border within precise time windows. A delay of even a few hours can shut down assembly lines in Michigan or Ontario, costing millions of dollars an hour. If Trump were to actually order border agents to slow down traffic or block the bridge opening, he would be inflicting immediate pain on the very blue-collar workers in Michigan he claims to champion. The United Auto Workers and other labor groups know this, which is why there is zero support for this move from the actual stakeholders on the ground. It is a threat made in a vacuum, detached from the logistical realities of the North American economy. Furthermore, the claim about U.S. alcohol being pulled from Canadian shelves is a distortion of minor trade disputes or provincial liquor board policies that have nothing to do with national trade deficits. It is a classic Trump tactic to take a small granular grievance and blow it up into a national crisis to justify a massive retaliation. By conflating minor regulatory issues with the opening of a multi-billion-dollar bridge, he is engaging in asymmetric bargaining, trying to trade a molehill for a mountain. Canada's refusal to engage in this kind of transactional chaos is a testament to the Carney doctrine of steady, predictable governance. We must also consider the international signal this sends. Canada is not the only ally watching this. Europe, Japan, South Korea, and Australia are all observing how Canada handles this pressure. If Canada were to capitulate and pay compensation for a bridge it already paid for, it would set a precedent that every trade agreement with the U.S. is open for renegotiation based on the president's mood. By drawing a hard line, Carney is not just protecting Canadian taxpayers, he is defending the rules-based international order. He is signaling that agreements signed in ink cannot be erased by posts on social media. The reference to China in Trump's post is also strategic if entirely fabricated. By accusing Canada of a secret deal with Beijing, he is trying to trigger the China hawk reflex in the U.S. Congress, hoping to rally support from Republicans who might otherwise oppose disrupting trade with Canada. It is a clumsy attempt to paint Canada as a security risk rather than an economic partner. However, the reality is that Canada has been moving in lockstep with the U.S. on many issues regarding Chinese trade practices, including tariffs on EVs and steel. The accusation holds no water, but it is designed to muddy the waters to create enough confusion that the base supports the aggression. This brings us back to the concept of the dangerous feedback loop. When a leader surrounds himself with sycophants who validate his misconceptions, policy becomes unmoored from reality. If Trump believes Canada owes him money because his advisors are afraid to tell him otherwise. We are in a dangerous position where diplomacy is impossible because we are not operating in the same factual universe. This is why Carney's approach of public transparent fact checking is so vital. It is not just about correcting the record for Canadians, it is about bypassing the gatekeepers and speaking directly to the American business community and political class who know the truth. The Carney doctrine of diversification is the long-term winner in this story. The fact that Canada is less rattled by this than it would have been 10 years ago proves that the strategy is working. The comprehensive economic and trade agreement with Europe and the Trans-Pacific Partnership have given Canadian exporters other options. We are no longer solely dependent on the mood in Washington. This independence allows for the kind of self-respect-based foreign policy that Doug Ford called for. We can afford to say no. We can afford to stand our ground. That is a luxury Canada did not always have, and it changes the entire dynamic of the relationship. As we look at the footage of the bridge nearing completion, it stands as a physical manifestation of the integration between our two countries. It is a feat of engineering, a bridge spanning not just a river, but two nations. It was built to speed up travel, to reduce emissions from idling trucks, and to secure the economic future of the region. To try to turn it into a toll booth for political tribute is a betrayal of the spirit in which it was built. The bridge is named after Gordie Howe, a man who was born in Saskatchewan but became a legend in Detroit. He represents the best of the U.S.-Canada connection, tough-skilled and respected on both sides of the border. Trump's pettiness is the antithesis of that legacy. In the coming days, we will likely see this rhetoric escalate. There will be more posts, perhaps threats of tariffs or executive orders, but the fundamentals remain unchanged. The bridge is built, the contracts are signed, the ownership is legally codified, and the economic necessity of the crossing is absolute. Canada's leadership has signaled that they are ready to ride out the storm. They have prepared for this. They have the facts on their side, and increasingly they have the leverage. The era of Canada rolling over is over. The era of politely accepting insults is over. What we are witnessing is the maturing of Canada as a sovereign power that is friendly with the United States but subservient to no one. It is a painful transition, and it comes with risks, but it is necessary. If this crisis proves anything, it is that relying on the goodwill of a volatile neighbor is not a strategy. Building your own bridges, both literal and metaphorical, is the only way to ensure national survival. The Gordie Howe Bridge will open, traffic will flow, and Canada will continue to chart its own course regardless of the noise coming from the south. Thank you for watching this special report on Canada Today. If you value fact-based analysis that cuts through the noise and strong Canadian leadership that refuses to back down, subscribe to our channel. We will continue to track this story as it develops, exposing the political theater and focusing on the real consequences for your job, your economy, and your country. We will see you next time.